For those who haven't seen part 1, I highly recommend it. Definitely check that out because a lot of the context within that will be transferred over to this. Just as a very brief summary, we looked at what would have happened if the British Empire hadn't existed, in the sense of not having any non-white colonies, no colonies in Africa, in the Caribbean and in India. In this scenario, we're going to look at what if Britain hadn't had any empire outside of, you know, the British Isles. What if it hadn't had any empire at all? What we have to understand with this is, as we mentioned in the last one, Ireland has always been the back door of Europe to Britain. A lot of the times in the last few hundred years when there's been an attempt to invade Britain, it's been through the back door of Ireland. So as a result, it makes strategic sense for anyone who's running Britain to at least have a friendly Irish government, at bare minimum, or at least a neutral one. Even in World War II, Churchill even debated whether it made sense to occupy Ireland because of Irish neutrality, because it obviously would have been a lot easier to have had ships come in to Irish ports rather than having to try and avoid the U-boats and come straight to Britain. That was a serious proposal that Churchill had in our timeline. This shows just how important Ireland is to Britain's kind of sense of national security. A hostile government in Ireland, or a hostile foe in Ireland, whether it's Irish or not, that is something which strategically speaking, Britain can't really allow in geopolitical terms. So in this scenario, Ireland is a British colony, but apart from that, there's no British presence in Canada, in America, in Australia, in New Zealand, right? How would you have to excuse there's like a storm outside, damn. Never mind about that. In this scenario, we have to really think about what the world would have been like. We already said in the previous timeline that France would have been the dominant power, kind of around the world. And so it's very much the same in this timeline, just even more so. But it's also something to note that actually the Dutch in this timeline would probably have had a much stronger position. Because in our own regular timeline, the Dutch did have colonies in America. They did explore the region around Australia. You obviously had the Dutch East Indies, which is modern day Indonesia. So inevitably at some point Australia was going to be discovered. Not discovered, from a European perspective, was going to be discovered, because obviously there was Aboriginals living there, was going to be discovered by the Dutch. And the same thing with New Zealand. New Zealand is obviously named after a region within the Netherlands called Zeeland. There's really quite a strong connection there, and it would have been quite easy for Holland to have taken those lands, because the French weren't particularly interested in colonising any of that region. If we look at Canada, it most likely would have just been completely taken over by the French. You already had a New France in our timeline, which was basically everything kind of up from Louisiana in the south all the way to Quebec in the north. Without the British also competing in Canada, the French would have just had a free hand there. And then with regard to the modern day United States, Holland already had possessions in New Amsterdam, which is present day New York. Now the British kicked them out of that colony, but again, if the British hadn't been there, then there's nothing to say that the Dutch wouldn't have settled the east coast of America. What we have to really think about in this timeline is this. So the point of departure is going to be 1607. This is the year in which the English settlers, because Britain wasn't a concept at that point, English settlers in Virginia, they set up Jamestown. So this was the first successful permanent English settlement in North America. If for whatever reason this had failed, just as the last one had failed in Renu, I can't even pronounce it. Yeah, it's one looking with do a little bit of research and stuff. Yeah, because Renoic, I think, something like that. That failed because the settlers came there and they couldn't survive the winter. They didn't know how to grow the crops there, and they just died out. Thanksgiving in America is the celebration of the early settlers struggling to survive the winter, but the Native Americans show them how to grow food there, how to survive the winter, and that's basically what Thanksgiving is all about. If you didn't have the British being there at all, then the Dutch would have had a free hand in America. What's interesting to note with the Dutch is obviously in comparison to the British, they had much smaller population. Their population would be spread pretty thin at this point between possessions in America, between South Africa, between Australia and New Zealand. In our timeline, a lot of Dutch settlers went to South Africa, which obviously, which obviously the Afrikaans. America is obviously a lot closer to Holland than South Africa is. Australia and New Zealand even further away. So we can imagine a lot more Dutch people crossing the Atlantic and settling there then they would have gone to the tip of South Africa and to Australia and New Zealand. So you would have had very, very lightly populated settlements there, but you would have had a lot more emphasis and a lot more focus on the American colonies. What's interesting to note about the United States is that if you look at the different ethnicities there, a large percentage of people are actually of German descent. You know, the most populous ethnic group in America is, you know, the ancestors of Germans. And so it's nothing to say that the Dutch in this timeline, being short for population sources, would have also turned to the Germans. There was already a debate, like just before like kind of the time of independence, as to what the official language should be in the colonies, and it narrowly ended up being won by the English side, and it was only because of one German speaker who said, actually no, we probably should have it in English. The United States today could have ended up speaking German in our own timeline, so never mind a timeline where the British are not present at all. German settlers would have far outnumbered any Dutch. Dutch and German is relatively similar anyway, and so it would have been quite easy for that colony to basically been predominantly made up of German speakers, and the colony would have been German speaking. This really fundamentally like changes the United States, and it's really something to bear in mind. But even still, even with all of this, it would have been at very best, if the French had allowed it to continue and hadn't like taken it over for themselves, it would have been a tiny sliver on the East Coast, which wouldn't have been insignificant, because even in modern day America, of the 300 or so million people that live in the United States, 100 million live on the eastern seaboard. Even them having like colonies there, what might be the United States or whatever it ended up being called, or if it was to get independent at all, again, the butterfly effect is so crazy with this, like there's so many things taken into consideration, but all else being equal, we can imagine there would be quite a sizable population on the East Coast of America, but obviously very, very fundamentally different than it would have been in our timeline. In this scenario, we're going to focus a lot more on how Britain would have been different, because what a lot of people fail to recognise is that Britain's population today is roughly about 60 million. However, it's estimated that roughly about 20 million people left the British Isles to settle in the predominantly like white colonies. If there had been no British Empire, you wouldn't have had millions of people going to Australia and to Canada and to the United States and to New Zealand. That would have meant that the population of Britain would have been potentially at least 20 million people like bigger than it currently is. What would have been the impact of this? And then also bear in mind as well, as we mentioned in the last video, if there had been no non-white colonies, then there wouldn't have been a pull factor like kind of non-white people coming to Britain, and if there hadn't been any empire at all, then it would have been even more so a thing where people would have been, no, why are people coming to this country? We don't really need that. Now, to focus on what would have happened within the British Isles itself, with all these extra people, right? There's extra potentially 20 million people. Where would they have gone? The fact is that a lot of the people who did end up leaving came predominantly from the peripheries of Britain itself. It came more from like the so-called Celtic fringe. Many of them came from Scotland, and many of them came from Ireland. A lot of Irish people will hate me for associating them with the British, but during those times when we're talking about these 20 million people, it says from the British Isles, so Britain and Ireland. Without this kind of outlet, would they have left? Like, people from Scotland and Ireland might have basically done what they did in our timeline, but instead of going to a British-owned like kind of America, they might have gone to a Dutch-owned America, because obviously they would have wanted land. They would have wanted freedom. Holland would have had a huge like population shortage to actually fill like kind of these colonies. So there is a chance in which you would have had mass migration out of the British Isles to these places. But assuming that this didn't happen, then there would have been a lot more pressure for more democratic reforms at home. We already see with the Chartist movement, we already see with many of these other kind of like movements for democracy. Although Britain was a lot more freer and a lot more democratic than a lot of other countries on the continent, it was still a situation where people, the established order were very hostile to common people actually having a say. And this is why, for instance, it took until World War I that working class men were able to have the right to vote, for instance. If this hadn't have happened, if they hadn't been able to just export their problems and be like, oh, here's some troublesome people, like, oh, like go to Australia, go to America, go somewhere else here, right? If you wouldn't have had this kind of this outlet, this release of pressure, then there would have been a lot more pressure on the establishment to have had a lot of these things, to have had welfare reforms, to have had a more democratic state. In many regards, the standard of living and like the quality of life for people and the actual sense of like having a greater say in how the country would have been run, it would have happened a lot earlier in this timeline than it would have in like our own like real life timeline. If all this happened, where would people have gone? In our own timeline, we had the Ulster plantations. We're probably going to do an alternative history on what if the Stuarts had never like ruled England, and that will come at a later date. But King James VI of Scotland, when he became King James I of England, he wanted to kind of unite two quarrelsome kingdoms together. People in Scotland were very hostile to a union with England, and people in England were very hostile to a union with Scotland. Along the border, you had very, very troublesome people who would constantly do raiding, etc. People were at a loss of what to do with these kind of like these troublesome like people who lived at the border. And so what James I kind of did as an outlet to that and to help bring a bit of harmony between England and Scotland is that he said, right, you lot might be English and Scottish, right? But you're both Protestant. We have a Catholic Ireland which needs to be settled, yeah, which needs to be like sorted out. He basically said, right, you know, we'll set up plantations. So if you come to Ireland, you lot will have all the land you want, you can become rich, etc., etc. You lot move there and basically like kind of take over that region. And that's why Northern Ireland today is predominantly Protestant still. Protestants who live there, they are actually the descendants of people who came from that troublesome border region. If you had this situation whereby you didn't have an outlet to America, to Australia, to all these other places, it might have been a thing where it might have been the policy of London to have encouraged even more people from Scotland and from other places, yeah, to have settled Ireland. What you had within the Ulster plantations, you might have had it large scale across the whole of Ireland, predominantly in the region of Ulster and in the region of Leinster, right? I think I pronounced that right, not sure. You might have had even more Protestant people, even more people from Great Britain settled in Ireland. Would Ireland have got the same level of independence? In our timeline, we already had the Troubles, we already had Irish wars of independence, etc., the Irish Civil War, all of that. If you'd had even more Protestants like living there, would that have potentially shifted the balance of power so much that the Catholic kind of native Irish people wouldn't have had the facilities to kind of like rise up against that? Who knows, right? Like, you know, with this scenario, it really depends. There's a lot of complexities to that. I'll be quite interested to see in the comment section, like, actually, do I really want the comment section to light up about this? The question of like Britain and Ireland is very contentious as it is. So please be nice. Please be nice.